this is chapters 21 and 22. Chapter 21, The Murders of Bob, Sarah, and Stephen Carlson, September 18th, 1958. The tape recorder was gone, but Nancy brought me a pen and one of my dad's notebooks. She said since it was only us we could move down to the interrogation room, or I could sit with Marie inside the cell. But Marie joked that she would miss the bars and wouldn't recognize me if she could see all of my face at once. I don't think she wanted anything to change. It's difficult to explain. She hadn't been free for a long time, but at least her incarceration with us had been on her own terms, and I'd like to think that it wasn't all terrible. So we sat like we always had, her on her cot and me at the kitchen table, though we left the cell door open and Nancy brought us cups of coffee. It didn't feel official without my father there and without the tape recorder, without Pilson looking over my shoulder, but I was glad that it happened anyway. This part of the story belonged to Black Deer Falls. It was ours the way that Steve and his parents had been ours, and it was right that we would know it first, before the rest of the world. Marie's accounting of the events of September 18th were difficult to hear. Her story was at times disjointed. Some parts she narrated as well as any storyteller. Other times she got stuck and needed me to nudge her along with questions. She repeated the conversations of that night like she was reciting lines from a play. I had to stop her a few times and ask who was speaking, but I took everything down. This is what she told me. They had begun to quarrel on the road. It started in Madison, Wisconsin. They had begun to quarrel on the road. It started in Madison, Wisconsin when Marie had refused to kill Richard Covey and his fiancée, Stancy Lee Brandberg. They were supposed to be for her, Marie's first kills, carefully selected. So when she refused, he got angry. They seemed so resolute, she said, holding on to each other in the empty house. They'd heard all about us on the radio and read about us in the papers. They knew what was going to happen, but still they didn't scream or try to run. They didn't panic. I said it wasn't like he promised. They knew what we were going to do. He hadn't used his tricks on them. But he said, the first time can never be easy. The first time you leave everything behind. But I wouldn't, so he did it himself. And he didn't mean. He made the boy watch while he cut her throat, made him keep his eyes open. Then he cut him twice in one wrist, made him bleed out slower. How long did it take Richard Covey to die? At least a half hour, much longer than the rest. He was mad all the time after that. He said I'd been lying to him, playing a part, that I lacked courage and he made a mistake. I said he could go ahead and kill me then and start over, but he said we'd already come too far. My mother was already dead. He'd killed her for me, and he'd killed Nathaniel, and as much as I wanted Nathaniel dead, I loved my mother and cried and cried. Do you want to tell me about what happened to your mother, how she died? No, but I wish I hadn't told you where she was buried. She didn't deserve to be dug up like that, photographed. She paused for a long time here, and then spoke at length about how they came to Black Deer Falls. They came into Black Deer Falls on foot and wandered the back roads through dusk until the sun went down. There had been no hunt, no plan until the headlights of Steve's Chevy caught them walking on the side of the road. It had all been by chance. It could have been me in my dad's old truck, or it could have been Percy. Steve hit the brakes and pulled over, and Marie and her companion walked in the red of his taillights right up to the passenger door. I can imagine it as if I'd been there. Steve, leaning over to get a better look and then reaching to pop the door open. He'd have been in his varsity leather jacket, but it wasn't cold yet, so it wouldn't have been buttoned. He'd have smiled and asked them where they were headed. It was easy to tell him our car had broken down and ask if we could use his family's telephone. He was nice. So nice. And I thought, he'll never try to make me kill this one, and he's so similar to Richard Covey. But when we got to his house and spoke with his family, I knew I was wrong. Steve parked the car in the usual place in the empty side of one of the large red barns and walked them inside. I stopped here to ask if Marie was sure. Widow Thompson saw you walk into the house together, but only you and Steve. Are you sure it was the three of you? I am. You're sure he didn't go on ahead or trail behind? He was right there, on Stephen's other side. I let her go on. Inside the house, Mrs. Carlson had just finished cleaning up the kitchen from supper. Mr. Carlson was in the living room settling down with a newspaper. Steve said he'd been at his girlfriend's house eating dinner and watching television with her family. Kathy Ferry, though they had not been going steady, and she didn't call herself his girlfriend after he died. The house was warm and lived in. The rich smell of that evening's stewed beef and potatoes hung in the air and permeated every room. Mrs. Carlson said there was still some left if they hadn't eaten yet. "You look like you could use some color in your cheeks," Sarah said. "How about some coffee? Or I could get a pie into the oven. It's no trouble. I can make a crust with my eyes closed, and there are dozens of jars of filling in the pantry." "Just coffee, please," said Marie. "Thank you." Sarah poured a cup of coffee for Marie and set it on the table. Marie heard Steve and his father in the other room conversing with him and laughing. "I knew it was a trick to keep them from being put off by his appearance in the light." Sarah decided to start a pie anyway, and asked if Marie was partial to apple or cherry. She didn't think anything of getting bowls out and flour and making a mess of her kitchen, even though it was plain that she'd just finished tidying up. She said she thought I looked like an apple girl. That's when I heard the baby. She started to fuss from her crib in a room just off the kitchen. "You have a baby?" Marie asked. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah fetched the child up out of the crib. "Patricia, a surprise for everyone, believe me, after all those years of hoping when Steve was little. But here she is, our little Patty. Stephen," she called, "come and get this pile of folded laundry and bring it up to your room before the pie's done." He came and took it, and from the living room Marie heard a voice. "Don't go up the stairs." "That will be fine. Set it just there." And Steve set the laundry on the step and went back to sit on the couch. I got up and went in there. They were all sitting around chatting, chuckling at nothing, like they had known each other for ages. I said, "There's a child, a baby." And he said, "Crueler to leave her alive, don't you think, than to send her along with her family?" Steve and his father, his mother, didn't seem to hear this exchange at all. Neither man had looked up when Marie approached, and in the kitchen Sarah had put Patricia into a high chair and gone back to making the dough. "He had this look in his eyes, and it made me angry. I don't know at what. I didn't want to do it, but I felt like I needed to prove it to him that I could. I was mad about the baby. I was angry that they were such nice people." "Well, if you're going to do it," Marie said, "don't make her go to the trouble of a whole goddamned pie." I was shaking all over, and he said, "Sarah, will you and the children come in here, please?" He called, and she obeyed, even with a smile on her face and the baby on her hip. He took the straight razor out of his pocket and opened it. "What's that there now?" Bob asked. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said. "Nothing at all. It's just something for her." He held it up, the blade shining in the yellow light cast by the two humble lamps. I stared at it, and then noticed the curtains had been pulled shut, and I asked him if he'd done it. "No, dear, I did that," said Sarah. "Our neighbor lives alone and likes to look in on us. She's a sweet old thing, but sometimes we need a little privacy." Then she went back to cooing at the baby. I walked over to him and took the razor. I asked him if we needed all three. It seemed like a lot. And he said, "You could have had two back in Madison." So I looked down at Steve, who was sitting next to him on the couch. I asked him if they had to be looking. "Look away," he said, and Steve did. Marie turned away from him, though, and went to his father. Slowly, she touched the razor to the skin of his throat. I kept expecting him to leap up, to realize what was happening. The blade had to feel cold and strange, but he didn't even flinch. He didn't seem to notice at all, so I just leaned down and did it. "You did it?" She didn't answer me. She wasn't looking me in the eye. Throughout the recounting, she hadn't looked over my shoulder or towards the floor. Sometimes she watched the movements of my pen. It was easier than I thought, but I went too deep, and it got on me. I tried to drink it, but there was a lot. He tried to help, moved my head, and that was better. When she couldn't do any more, he got off the couch and nudged her aside to clean up the mess. Then he let Bob Carlson slide down from the chair and onto the rug. Mrs. Carlson, she didn't know really what was happening, but just the same, she had started to shush the baby like she was fussing something awful, even though she wasn't making a sound. She just kept shushing her and bouncing her and not looking at her husband on the floor. I said, "That's enough, that's plenty." And he said, It's not. You need more. I'm full. You're not. He told Steve to come and take the baby. Then he went to Mrs. Carlson, and he did it, and I just went along, I guess, like in a dream. It all felt like a dream by then, and there was so much in the taste, but that was it. That was all I could do. What do you mean, Marie? I mean, I knew the boy and the baby would be next. So while he was finishing off Mrs. Carlson, I clenched my stomach until I threw up. I didn't think it would ever come out. I thought, out, 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 and I knew it wouldn't, but I threw my head back, and all of a sudden it did, right out of my mouth. It bubbled up over her face and over her hair, so much that it soaked through her clothes and ran all the way down to her shoes. I remembered how she looked, sticky and red from head to toe. I told Steve to run, to take the baby and get out of the house, but he didn't move. The baby started to cry, and he set her down on the rug. I yelled, "Get out now, you have to." But he said, "He won't." So I said, "You go then, I'm not coming with you." Did he seem surprised? Angry? No, he didn't seem surprised by any of it, not even the sight of me like I was. I thought for a minute he might just kill me too, kill me and disappear, and I would become part of the mystery. But he didn't. I stood between him and the baby, and then he left, but not before he shot past me and killed Steve. Marie said she stayed between him and Patricia after he dropped Steve to the floor, and I pictured her there, teeth bared, covered in red. And that's how Charlie and your dad found me, standing on the rug with the baby. She had nearly cried herself out by then, but I couldn't pick her up and comfort her. It wouldn't have been right. It was late by the time we finished. Our cups of coffee were empty. It was quiet in the jail. Still, outside the window, the sky was black. "So, Mr. and Mrs. Carlson," I said, "you killed them." "I killed them," she said. She reached her hand through the bars, and I leaned forward and took it, and she closed her eyes and cried. Chapter 32. Leaving Black Deer Falls. The next morning, my dad burst in and found me asleep in his office. He looked pretty relieved to see me, even though I don't think he really believed that I would help Marie break out of jail. He let me clean up in the bathroom and got Charlie to bring in fresh coffee and some donuts from the diner. Nancy came in too, even though her shift was over and it was her day off. I told them what had happened and what Marie had confessed. "Why would she say that?" Nancy asked after I finished. "She couldn't have. She always said she never hurt anyone." "What does her story matter anyhow?" asked Charlie. "If it's not true, if she's still going on with that blood-drinking nonsense." "Because it was the truth," my dad replied. "Take out the wild tales and I reckon it is just what happened. The Carlsons still have family here, and they deserve to know everything there is to know if they want to." He looked at me. The fact that Marie had killed circled in the air, along with the knowledge that this strange story was nearing its end. Soon there would be no more letters to the Star about our mishandling of the case. No more phone calls to my mother about how ashamed I should be for cheapening the Carlsons' memory. No more Marie sitting quietly upstairs. Later that day, we got word that Pilson had petitioned to have Marie brought to Nebraska for trial. Now that he had her identity in the body of her mother, his claim was at least as strong as ours. So the lawyers came and got her again and brought her back to the Capitol. This time, I wasn't allowed to attend. I was sick all that day, thinking I would never see Marie again, that she would be given over immediately and moved to Lincoln, before she came back that night. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "You won?" But they hadn't won. It was plain in Marie's sad smile, on the defeated, exhausted faces of Mr. Nesquit and Mr. Porter. "They're trying her in Lincoln for the murder of Audrey Cody," Mr. Nesquit said. "They're coming to transfer her in 2 days." "Then why are you back?" I asked. "She's here just long enough to plead guilty to the Carlson murders?" She's here just long enough to plead guilty to the Carlson murders, Mr. Porter said. "And she's here because the judge didn't care for Mr. Pilson." I didn't know what to say. Neither did Marie. I think she figured there was never any other way it could go. The state of Nebraska didn't charge her with the murders of Peter Knupp, Angela Hawk, or Beverly Nordahl. Pilson didn't have the evidence, I guess, to feel confident about prosecuting the rest. Or maybe he figured that her mother would be enough. People were mad at first. They wanted justice on all counts, but eventually they resigned themselves to his decision. It was, after all, like I heard some say, You could only electrocute her once. I didn't go home much in the 2 days before Marie was taken away. I ate my meals with her up in our old kitchen. When I had to, I would go home and get cleaned up and come right back. School was forgotten. At night, Nancy or Bert would let me into Marie's cell, and I would sleep curled up against her on the narrow cot. When I awoke in the morning, I would find her arm around me, gripping my shirt, the fabric wrinkled between her tight, slender fingers. The morning of the day that Pilsen was to arrive, Marie asked if my mom would come and cut her hair into a bob. So my mom came with her scissors and did it while Marie was seated at our old kitchen table. "Perfect," my mom said when she was finished. At that length, the waves in it stood out more, and truthfully it looked less perfect than wild. My mom tried to tie it back with green ribbon, and then immediately pulled it out again. It wouldn't all stay, and the ribbon made Marie look too young for any of us to bear. "I'll keep the ribbon anyway," said Marie. "I'll keep the ribbon anyway," said Marie. My mom smoothed Marie's hair back and tucked it behind her ear. Then she left, and Bert came up to put Marie back into her cell. "You know, I'd let you stay out," he said. It's all right, Bert," she said, and he swung the door shut between us and left us to ourselves. "Are you afraid?" I asked. "I suppose." "Do you want me to be there? I'll come to the trial and to whatever happens after if you want me to. I'll have my dad—" "No." She knew what was going to happen. She knew she was going to lose. "I don't want that. You have to promise me that you won't." So I promised. Much of that last day together we spent in silence. We sat in our quiet, familiar place and listened to the clock tick away the minutes. I listened to her breath and knew I would remember the sound. "You don't have any more questions?" she asked. "What do you think is left to tell?" She leaned back against the bars. Her new hair, shorter, made her neck look bare and long. "Nothing, I guess," she said. "But anyone you know would be asking for more." She looked at me and smiled a little. "I wish I'd met you first," she said, and I wished for that too, even though I knew it could have never been. It was the murders that had brought her to me, and without them we never would have met. It was a terrible thought, and it was terrible knowing that I didn't entirely regret it. Pilsen came to collect her with a caravan of state police. Reporters swarmed the station. Even Mr. McBride had staked out the building since morning, not wanting to miss the moment she was brought out. My dad put the handcuffs on her and walked her down, and he let me walk with them. "I don't know what there is to be done," he said to her, "but I think you could still save yourself if you just told them where he went. I really wish you would." We walked through the station and through the front doors to the parking lot where Pilsen waited. Charlie and Bert were on hand to keep the reporters at a respectable distance, and the state patrol that Pilsen had brought in did their best to help out. When Pilsen saw Marie, he nodded grimly and said, "You've got a moment." Then he ducked into the passenger seat of the car. Marie took a deep breath and looked around. It was the first time she'd been outside in months, the most fresh air she'd breathed. I was glad the day was warm. It wasn't spring yet, but it was one of those early days where the scent and the feel of it were in the breeze. She turned at me. I searched for something smart to say. She was wearing her familiar blue jeans rolled at the ankles and her white button shirt. Instead of her usual green sweater, she wore a blue one that Nancy had gotten for her. Nancy, who stood to one side with Charlie and quietly cried into a handkerchief. Marie lifted her cuffed hands and looped them over my head. She pulled me close and I hugged her gently, and she whispered into my ear, her voice too low and close for anyone to hear. She whispered what she felt. She whispered her regrets. Then she took her hands back over my head and pressed them flat against my chest. "You never did bring me those smokes," she said. And then Mr. Pilsen got back out of the car, and they pulled us apart, and the reporters closed in like a flock of crows. And then Marie Catherine Hale was gone. Marie's trial lasted for 2 weeks. As expected, she didn't change her story, and the headlines blazed. Doctors and psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate her, and she was found to be competent. They said she was willfully making it up. The paper said the jurors were released at 5:25 p.m. on Thursday night to deliberate. They broke for supper at 6:30 and would not bring back a verdict until Friday evening. They found her guilty with a recommendation of death. According to witnesses in the courtroom, Pilsen had been right. There were several gasps of shocked surprise, but no one wept. After Marie's sentencing, the mood in Black Deer Falls and across the nation shifted. Groups came out in support of her, asking for mercy. Those same people who for all the weeks and months before had called her a seductress now called her a child. Mr. McBride published a letter to the editor in the Star titled, "Who but God has the right to vengeance?" submitted by one Mrs. Victoria McRuddy, who my dad said had once come to the station to complain about Marie being held there. Even in Nebraska, the outcry was such that Pilsen held a press conference. It was unprecedented, reporters said, sentencing a girl to death who had never been in the 10th grade. And Pilsen's reply made headlines of its own. Even 15-year-old girls must realize that they cannot go on 16 victim murder sprees. After the furor had settled down, Agent McCabe quietly suspended the search for Nathaniel Cody. He'd not been seen or heard from since the murders ended, and it was reasoned that he had long gone over the border to Canada. Marie Catherine Hale was set to be executed by hanging in Lincoln, Nebraska on May 8, 1959. It was expected to go on as scheduled, as she had no intent to file an appeal. After the trial, everyone seemed to forget all about Marie's blood drinker story, in the same way that they forgot about the missing blood and the symbols carved into the trees in Steve Carlson's headstone. The same way they forgot about the snake nailed to my door and the man who stood in my family's living room in the middle of the night. That was just a hallucination anyway, a bad dream. Even Marie said so, since he couldn't have come in without being invited. But I never had the chance to tell Marie about a conversation I had with Dawn. About a week after Marie left for Nebraska, I asked Dawn if she seen anyone strange in town. "No," she said, "except for the man who was lost." "Who was lost?" I asked. "He came by the house one afternoon. He looked cold, so I asked him to come in and made him a cup of coffee and let him use the telephone." "You invited him in?" I said. "Dawn, what was his name?" She couldn't remember, even though she'd sat right by him and called him by it. "Was it before or after I'd been sleepwalking?" I asked. "Before." She hadn't bothered by her lapse in memory, and when I asked her what he looked like, she smiled and said, "Like a film star." Like a film star, not like a movie star, or a handsome prince, or any other phrase she might have been more likely to say. But those exact words, the same words that Marie had used, like they had been planted in both of their heads. In the days leading up to Marie's execution, I thought often about the other victims, Cheryl Warrens, Richard Covey, and Stacy Lee Brandberg. I thought about the woman buried with Marie's mother in the abandoned house, Lorraine Disquette. I thought about the made-up property owner, Peter Quince. 5 years he had owned that house, according to the county records. 5 years of not living there, of coming and going from other places. 5 years of filling it with strange objects. I wondered if they had come home with the house. I wondered if he had known Lorraine Disquette before he killed her. But there will be no answers to those questions. The investigations have stopped. This is all there is, Marie's accounting of the events. We can only know what she knew and what she believed to be true. Maybe it doesn't matter. The people who were killed will remain dead. Steve and his parents, Peter Knupp, there is no bringing them back, no matter what answers we think we may find or what mysteries we think we solve. The vampire got away. The vampire never was.